Hello everyone, this is a session for the HRM and Development in a Global Context module, and it's on approaches to training and development by multinational enterprises. Now, multinational enterprises today are located in many different parts of the world. We've seen foreign direct investment into African countries, for instance, parts of the Middle East, South Asia, and the impact that they have is something that's discussed in terms of broader society. And if we think about that, we can see, if we look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the way in which multinationals will certainly have an impact on things like decent work and economic growth, and on Sustainable Development Goal 4 about quality education. So an equitable quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for all. And we know that when multinationals move into different areas of the world, they can have an impact in terms of skills development, educating certain populations. This recent paper by Narula and Pinelli highlights the fact that multinational enterprises are catalysts of economic development, and that came to the forefront of policy not much more than around 50 years ago. And it remains, this debate about the role of multinationals in this sense remains a very pertinent issue within a number of academic disciplines, so economics, sociology and management studies. And the importance of multinationals and that wider impact on society and the potential for that to be positive in some cases and negative in others is still very much under discussion. And Narula and Pinelli suggest that we know multinationals can be what they call engines for knowledge transfer, capital deepening, employment and structural change, but their investments can also be a double-edged sword. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So if we think about what attracts multinationals to locate in particular countries, in some cases it might be because there are already high levels of human capital, so knowledge, skills, expertise, and also perhaps the infrastructure that they require and technological capabilities. So in some instances, multinationals are looking for those resources, human and other resources, to be in place to readily tap into. And Kell argued that multinationals may just bring low skilled aspects of their work to a country. So they may be looking to exploit low wages and bring the kind of less skilled work to a country. So in this sense, we might say, how much are multinationals really kind of contributing to society in its wider sense? In other countries, developing countries such as Malaysia, we've seen multinationals improve local skills to quite some degree. Sometimes that skill development is again around lower skilled manufacturing kind of processes, and the skills may be routine, but it can be a starting point that is then built on as the population develops its knowledge and its skill base. Now, in terms of this idea of a double-edged sword that Narula and Pinelli were talking about, some more recent evidence from Africa, from Jiboku and Akpan, highlights how countries such as Africa have been very keen to attract foreign direct investment as part and parcel of their bid for economic transformation and to build up their human capital. And they suggest that Nigeria is an example of how nearly a century of multinational corporations' operations has not resulted in any meaningful acquisition of strategic as opposed to merely high level skills. by local employees. So they're questioning really the longer term benefits, saying, this is a country where we've seen multinationals, here for almost a century, but really the evidence that they have this wider positive kind of impact. Certainly if we're looking at the really kind of meaningful kind of skills and that ability for local employees to start running bigger organisations and making those strategic decisions, that evidence really is limited, and that we're actually still seeing quite big disparities between local employees and an expatriate workforce within the same multinational enterprise. So this brings us to think about, who is it that's actually being trained or developed in a multinational, and in what? Managers tend to be the recipients of more training and development today in many organisations. But is it the parent company managers, or is it local managers in subsidiaries? Is the training the same for those managers? Is it consistent across a multinational? Employee level, is it just basic skills that are required, or is it more than that? And again, is there the same level of skills development in the parent country as there is in the subsidiaries? So these are questions really that we need to think about, and go back to that overall approach when we think about, is it a polycentric or an ethnocentric type of approach that organisations have? If we look at recent surveys conducted by PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, we've seen that global CEOs, when they've been surveyed in 2014, they were suggesting a great concern about lack of skills of employees, but they'd been doing so, the survey suggested, for the last 7 years. And if we consider that, then we might consider, well, okay, so what are those global CEOs really doing about it? If they're complaining for that number of years, are they actually investing, making that investment in people? PwC's 2019 global survey said 79% of those CEOs who responded saw digital skills, leadership skills and analytical skills as key, and you can download the report and have a look at that, but I think that's showing very consistent results with a lot of other surveys that we see today. So what is it that influences the multinationals' training and development strategy? Partly their location, and that location is going to be shaped in itself by their broader strategy. Are they looking for cost leadership, and they therefore looking to produce goods in the cheapest possible way, and they're looking for kind of low skilled, low cost environment to do that? So it will depend on the type of industry, sector that they're in. And there's also likely to be some consideration of nation states and their education systems and their training systems. So what is the potential within a country? Is there, the possibility that multinational can be involved and forge a good relationship there and be part and parcel of that development and training at a more national level, or is it going to be all down to them? As I've already indicated, there will be these broader institutional considerations, so the level of literacy and numeracy rates. If we look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, then they suggest that somewhere around 750 million adults worldwide are illiterate, and quite a high number of those are women in less developed parts of the world who don't receive an education and are completely illiterate. So that's going to be a consideration. In some countries there is a lack of qualified teachers, so international students may be sponsored to travel to Europe or the States, for instance, to access knowledge and then bring it home. and we've seen China using that approach in fairly recent years, whilst domestically improving their own higher education system. So while some universities have seen very, very high numbers of Chinese students over the last decade or so, we're starting to see the Chinese try to retain more of their own students and building up the reputation of their own higher education institutions, with a view to then obviously cascading that and developing the educational levels of the wider population. Another consideration will be what type of organisation a multinational is looking to build. Is it looking to build this idea of a learning organisation? And Garvin suggested this is an organisation that is very skilled at creating, acquiring and transferring knowledge. And being able to adapt and change, basically, to modify its behaviour when it responds to that knowledge and to insights. So new ideas are key if learning is to take place, but the right environment for discussion and knowledge sharing, knowledge management is absolutely key to all of this. And then change management techniques as well that enable the organisation to help people adapt and the organisation itself to move forward and to improve. So is there really a real kind of learning organisation type culture? And again, that's going to go back to, what's the purpose of this organisation? What is it really kind of focused on? Does it come from what Beer and Noria talked about as being a theory E approach, which is very much focused on kind of economic outcomes and totally economically driven around kind of profit, or does it have a more theory O type approach, and that is a more longer term organisational development type emphasis within the organisation? So in terms of approaches to training and development broadly, not just within multinationals, but multinationals are big organisations that are likely to invest more in training and development and to use a variety of different approaches or strategies to this. This is a figure that's taken from a particular handbook, and that's on the reading list here. So it's not a particularly high quality figure, but it does sum up approaches to training and development today, and this idea of transformation or change. So are we asking people to learn and to develop in order to change and improve themselves, and also to change and improve the wider organisation? Does all this kind of fit together in a coherent way? And there's certainly within the educational literature and the training and development literature more broadly, a focus now on the types of methods that will lead to high transformation, or the potential for high transformation, and that's very much seen to come much more from experiential learning and on the job type of experience. So you're all studying at master's level, so you're all engaged in formal learning down here, and hopefully you're acquiring new knowledge and maybe some new ways of thinking. I think perhaps ways of thinking are one of the more transformational aspects of formal educational programs today. We'd hope that perhaps one of the more transferable skills is that you come out and think about things differently and apply some kind of frameworks and techniques to help you do that. But certainly, so business kind of seminars, lectures, self-studying that you do is down at this formal learning end. But it's a relatively low potential for actually really changing you. As you get involved into this more kind of immersive type of learning, so through things like role playing, simulation, and being part and parcel perhaps of project groups, that kind of thing, or taking trips and shadowing experiences, those type of things, you're moving more into a form of learning that is likely to be more developmental. And right at the top, we've got these much more kind of sophisticated simulations, international assignments, which we talked about earlier in the module, as having this high potential to transform individuals, and in a more cumulative effect, a knock-on effect to transform organisations. So experiential learning is really very much seen as key, really, for organisations' development today. In terms of thinking about formal learning versus more informal or experiential learning, it's worth just stopping to think for a moment about what different cultures actually expect of training and development. And this is something that we see and we talk about quite a lot within higher education institutions, about expectations of students when they come to study, and how we notice from certain kind of countries and societies, perhaps there's more of an expectation of formal learning than in other cultures. So we may see some Asian employees may well expect more formal, more directive types of training approaches. So if that's the parent company, then that might be more in vogue in that type of type of culture. And they may well resist things like group work, group types of projects where there's a mixing of hierarchical levels. So where status is important, mixing the people from across the different kind of status levels may not really be so well accepted. Or any kind of learning experience that involves more what we in the West we might think of as constructive kind of criticism might be seen much more negatively by some Asian cultures. Scandinavian countries we tend to associate with greater kind of informality, quite inclusive and participative, so they're likely to expect that kind of learning environment and be more welcoming of direct feedback. Japanese may be unhappy with more experimental kind of training techniques. They're high on uncertainty avoidance, according to Hofstede's national cultural dimensions. You'll see that I've highlighted or put in italics may in relation to all of these. And it's like all of these things, we have to be careful that we don't just put people and label them and put them in boxes. We know, there are many workers who move around different cultures and perhaps, different aspects from different cultures rub off on them, we might say. They kind of are socialised into quite different kinds of cultures. So if we see workers who are quite international in their outlook, but maybe from, say, a Scandinavian background or an Asian background or whatever. So, we may see some of these things, and it's worth kind of considering what different cultures might expect and why different approaches sometimes work and sometimes don't from a cultural perspective. Just to hop back to that figure I showed about formal learning and more experiential learning. Formal learning, as I was talking about university settings, we do have some multinational corporations or multinational enterprises, whatever we want to call them, that have their own universities or schools. So McDonald's, Disney, Motorola are well-known examples of that. Something like McDonald's University, their managers and kind of prospective leaders will go through a week-long, quite intensive development program, and that's quite well known and quite well rated. So that would fall within an internal labour market type of approach. It's very much centred around the organisation and its policies and processes, but it equips people with skills that are transferable as well, and is seen as quite high quality, quite hard also to get a place and to be put forward for that. So that's part and parcel of formal learning, where organisations have their own kind of universities, but of course they may well draw on a range of methods and incorporate more experiential type learning methods within that. More developmental type of approaches. Some of those were shown on the figure there. One area that's of interest and has been growing over recent kind of years is this idea of the increased use of gaming, or what Armstrong and Landers talk about as gamification. You know, game simulation type exercises are really coming to the fore. Things like using virtual reality, those kind of things. And you can explore some papers around that if you're interested in that. There are some quite sophisticated simulation exercises, often used within leadership programs. One is the Power Lab exercise. So Barry Oshry, who's a developmental kind of consultant in the US, developed a power and systems simulation exercise. And this is a kind of managers and leaders who are involved in that are involved in taking different roles within a society, and often talk about top, middle and bottom type roles. So different social levels, and they're forced to kind of confront the different issues, the different levels of power that they have within that social system, how they utilize power. Those who've got power, do they utilize it and engage it? Do they run away from it? And so it really involves quite a lot of kind of self-questioning. And that exercise itself has been modified. It's been used in the English National Health Service with doctors. I've seen it used with junior doctors as part of a year-long leadership development program, and the educational aspect within that drew on Barry Oshry's Power Lab to get them to kind of think about these issues. So a number of different activities today draw on social learning theory or social cognitive theory, which is associated with Bandura. And Bandura showed that behaviour, which we can observe in individuals, is influenced by three factors. Personal factors, which are things like whether that individual has a high or low sense of self-efficacy towards a particular behaviour, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then the response and the feedback that they get from others after behaving in a particular way, and also environmental aspects, so aspects of the context which will influence the way individuals behave, whether they are successfully able to behave in a particular way. Now, a lot of this relates to learning from others and draws attention to the need for people to be aware of these things and to think about these things. So it's often an aspect that is again built into more formal programs. Self-efficacy is basically a person's belief, their own impression of their ability to do something, so to be able to perform or behave in a particular way. So sense of efficacy will influence our outcomes if we're facing an exam. So if we have a belief that we're just not going to be able to succeed and complete it, that's likely to impact on a variety of things, perhaps how much effort we put into it as well, and how successful we are. Or it can be personal things such as undergoing surgery. So we often think of this in relation to talk about positive mindsets have some influence. So do people really have that sense of belief? It might be that yes, with some support, with some training, yes, I can do this. And so factors such as a person's prior success in those tasks or similar tasks will influence their sense of self-efficacy. Physiological state will influence that. If we're thinking about something like undergoing personal surgery, how well we think we are generally, and how well. And in terms of the workplace, more often sources of persuasion, so other people's talk, really, how they influence us, will also have an impact. And developing a style of learning that enables performance is seen as having three stages or elements to it. what's summed up as a cognitive stage, and that's a person being exposed to new ideas in order to be able to expand their knowledge, in order to be able to start to see different ways of thinking and maybe begin to experiment with thinking differently. There's the behavioural aspect in that employees need to be able to internalise the new insights that they get from that exposure and then alter to behaviour. And that often requires time and space to do that. So lots of developmental programs that are run, particularly things around management and leadership development, will talk about the need for a safe psychological space and room within that kind of learning and development program for people to reflect. So reflective practice is key to that, and being able to discuss with role models that people respect, experts in a particular kind of area, as well as peers, and we talk about bouncing ideas off peers and thinking about new ways and thinking about what somebody else does in relation to a certain situation in a different organisation, for instance. And performance improvement aspects, then if that all happens, if they're exposed to those new ideas, somebody has time to kind of reflect on them, internalize the things that they think work for them and start altering their behavior, then we'd expect to see some longer term changes in behavior which lead to better outcomes, basically, better performance. Behaviour modelling training draws on some of the aspects I've recently been talking about. So based on social learning theory, a behaviour modelling programme will clearly set out the behaviours or skills that need to be learned and why. And there will also be some modelling of those behaviours. So we would expect the people who are leading that kind of programme to demonstrate desirable behaviours themselves, but maybe give some kind of indication of how not to behave, and that might be through demonstrations, videos, role plays, a range of different ways. That opportunity to practice the skills and behaviours in a safe environment that I was talking about, time for feedback to reinforce the positive ways of behaving, and very importantly thinking about that transfer of new behaviours into the workplace. And some of that may require people who are leading learning and development type programs to do some work with managers who are commissioning those programs, getting them to think about whether they actually model the behaviours that they're looking for all the time, about the need to actually provide opportunities for people to put these new skills and behaviours into practice, whether they need different types of rewards and incentives to kind of maintain that. So a number of things for the wider organisation to think about at times. One of the big challenges is around transfer of knowledge within the whole learning and development area. It's probably one of the debated kind of issues. Lots of different ways of transferring and sharing knowledge, which can be just through verbal reports and written reports. Inviting people on site visits and tours, rotating stuff around. There may be some type of standardisation programme, but we have to be careful that's not just reinforcing outdated ideas. The types of learning and development programme I've just been talking about. And another means that has come to the fore in the last couple of decades is through communities of practice. Now, communities of practice are associated very much with Latham Wenger's work, and they talk about a community of practice as a group of people who basically share similar problems, similar attitudes, and who interact regularly to learn together and to learn from each other. And they suggest that practice can be considered as frameworks, ideas, tools, information, different styles, a language, stories, documents, and so on. So we talk about communities of practice. We often think of those, and a lot of the early work around this was with professions. So things like, for instance, say the accounting profession has certain kind of frameworks and tools that it uses. There's a certain language that people who are new to that profession learn, and they start to learn that through that actual community of individuals who are involved in the same type of work as they are. So communities of practice are seeing as key to the transfer of what's been known as tacit knowledge, or knowledge which is difficult to kind of codify and write down, and it comes from that experience and know-how. So it's difficult to formally teach as part of formal education, and it's really acquired more through socialisation within that community of practice. Bevan talks about the benefits of communities of practice and suggests that it really enables us to have one foot in our organisation or our local system and another in the wider world. So we're interacting with people quite often with this same occupation, same profession in different organisations. And it's that really helps us see different perspectives, different possibilities that we wouldn't necessarily get from just interacting within our own world. We can draw on that wider range of skills and experiences. So it's fair to say that communities of practice, even if not labelled as such, have existed, particularly within the established professions, for many years. And there's a lot of debate, ongoing debate around them as to, are they actually conflict-free communities? Are there kind of power struggles and power relations at work within those communities of practice? In the sense of, novices, newcomers to that community, associating with expert practitioners. They've often been associated, and the professions themselves have been associated with this apprenticeship type model. So, high level of education, but a lot of also learning on the job. We can think about that in relation to medical doctors. High level of learning actually, on the wards with patients, as well as what goes on in the kind of more classroom-based learning. Do communities of practice actually just reproduce knowledge, or do they really generate new knowledge, and do they innovate? So, if we're thinking about, we talk about this term of best practice. Best practice is best practice at a particular point in time, and we know that knowledge develops. So it depends really on that community of practice, the kind of dynamics within that community, as to how innovative perhaps they are. And although it's very much come into vogue, Wenger is more cautious than some of his followers have been, and he suggests that actually, managers who are trying to establish communities of practice can't really do that. They can act in ways using very OD type language. They can try and create the conditions whereby a community of practice may more spontaneously emerge. But if they're trying to actually kind of shape it, it's likely to get kind of tarred with the kind of brushes, we might say, of that kind of management thinking. So having thought about some of the different approaches to training and development that multinationals as well as other organisations might consider today, an important aspect as well as that transfer of learning from a formal programme into the wider workplace and sustaining any change in knowledge and new behaviours. We need to really evaluate any formal training and development programmes that exist. There are lots of ways of doing that. One of probably the best known models for evaluating is the Kirkpatrick model, and that suggests that all programmes should be evaluated on 4 basic levels. Reactions, and this is often where at the end of some sort of formal programme you get asked to fill in some sort of quick survey, so to measure your original, your initial kind of thoughts, what worked well, what didn't work well, would you do this again, what was your facilitator, trainer or whatever like. learning. So some trying to actually kind of measure in some way. We think within a formal program like a university, we have lots of assessments that seek to kind of measure whether you've taken on board the key kind of knowledge that we would expect you to have. And then the behavioural aspect. So this important aspect of, what is the longer term impact on behaviour? And that needs thinking about, how can we actually measure that? What measures do we have in place to really kind of follow that up and to assess, whether behaviour has changed? Who's going to actually do that? Who's responsible for doing that? Is it through 360 or so, 450 or whatever degree feedback, where we get it from peers, bosses, customers, up, down and around, or what ways have we got of really trying to kind of get some sort of steer on that? And then finally, what's the impact in the broader business sense in terms of results? So, have we had a broader impact on the business? So this return on investment type of approach. And these types of measures, what will be suitable measures within a particular context, need thinking about right from the word go when any formal development programme is constructed. This is a quick copy from Sutton's book about the different pros and cons, really, benefits and drawbacks of different types of training methods. So you may want to just pause the video here and just have a look at that. But you can probably think through some of these things for yourself as well if you're working within an organisation. So in relation to multinational enterprises, issues to consider are around this idea of standardization, or what we might call global alignment of training and development. So, are multinationals able to standardize their approach to training and development? And there are a number of issues really to consider in relation to that. The type of work, where that work or different types of work located in different company bases, different subsidiaries, types of employee that exist, what's the range, can we standardize it across certain types of employee across all countries, or not? What are the actual outcomes that are being sought, and what methods are used, and what methods may be acceptable within different cultures to actually deliver? Is it appropriate culturally always to try and standardize? So what are the expectations, and what are the local systems and resources that are available? And finally, this is just one of the textbooks that is available as an ebook to look at on the reading list, and it covers a number of different areas around management education in relation to kind of reflective practice, for instance, and communities of practice and so on. So that's one resource that you might want to have a look at, along with some of the others on the reading list. Thank you for listening.